In the imposing city of New York, the skyscrapers gleamed like glass jewels reflecting the golden light of dusk. Among them stood the Santorini Bank Building, a century-old institution known not only for its financial solidity, but also for the arrogance of its owner, Riccardo Santorini. A middle-aged man with perfectly slicked-back gray hair, a tailored suit, and a smile that looked more like a warning of superiority, Riccardo was worth billions, and had the habit of treating everyone around him as disposable pieces, mere instruments to feed his vanity. Within that same building, under the shadow of all the ostentation, there was a simple man, Gabriel Duarte, the bank's driver for almost 10 years. Gabriel came from humble origins, raised in a poor neighborhood, used to facing life's hardships since childhood. Unlike his boss, he didn't wear expensive suits or imported shoes. His clothes were plain, his speech calm, and his eyes carried a spark of intelligence few noticed. One evening, during an extravagant gathering in the bank's luxurious ballroom, Riccardo hosted a dinner solely to impress foreign investors. The setting was sumptuous: crystal chandeliers, classical music playing softly, and waiters serving French champagne in crystal flutes. Between laughter and pompous speeches, Riccardo savored every chance to flaunt his power. Gabriel, as always, stood in the background. Stationed near the entrance, he discreetly observed the room while waiting for his boss to finish. He was not a part of the party, but his presence was always required. Still, his sharp eyes caught details others ignored: the suspicious glances of some investors, the tense whispers exchanged in corners. At a certain point, inflated by vanity, Riccardo decided to spice up the evening. He stood before the guests, raised his glass, and declared with a tone of challenge, "Gentlemen, in life there are those born to command and those born to obey, and that will never change." The phrase drew laughter from some, but uneasy looks from others. Gabriel, standing quietly at the back, remained still, though inside he felt the sting of humiliation. He knew very well who Riccardo was using as his invisible example: the silent chauffeur who followed him everywhere. Noticing the heavy silence, Riccardo pressed on, pointing subtly toward Gabriel. "Take my driver, for instance. A good man, hardworking but incapable of understanding even half of what we discuss here tonight. I bet my fortune he couldn't solve even the simplest challenge we face daily at this bank." The room erupted in laughter. Gabriel's face remained composed, but his soul burned. It wasn't the first time his boss used him as a target of mockery, but that night felt different. The way the words echoed, the weight of the promise, and the way every eye in the room turned to him as though he were nothing more than a joke. One of the foreign investors, intrigued, spoke up. "Bet your fortune. That is a bold statement, Mr. Santorini. What challenge would you give this man?" Riccardo laughed and replied, "Any. Financial math, market decisions, million-dollar negotiations. He could never do it." But to everyone's surprise, the investor turned to Gabriel and said, "And what if you gave him the chance to try?" The ballroom fell silent. All eyes were now on the driver, waiting for his reaction. At first, Gabriel thought of lowering his head, pretending he hadn't heard. But something inside him, perhaps years of swallowed humiliation, perhaps a hidden desire to prove his worth, made him lift his gaze. With surprising calm, he said, "If it's to prove that every person has their own capacity, I'll take the chance." A murmur spread through the room. Riccardo, irritated, tried to brush it off. "Very well then. Since you insist, I'll give you a simple challenge. If you succeed, I will admit here, before everyone, that I was wrong. But if you fail, I expect you to return to your place of silence and never again raise your eyes before me." The atmosphere grew tense. For many, this had already crossed the line into cruelty. Yet, at the same time, there was a near-palpable anticipation in the air. Could the chauffeur possibly stand a chance against the arrogant banker? And so, that night, in the middle of a ballroom filled with luxury, an unexpected game began. The challenge was not merely financial or intellectual, it was a duel of dignity. Ricardo believed the humiliation would be complete. Gabriel saw it as a rare chance to show the world, and above all, himself, that a man's worth is not measured by the position he holds, but by the strength of his mind and the courage to face the impossible. Gabriel Duarte was not born among sparkling chandeliers or crystal flutes. His cradle was a small wooden room in a workers' village on the outskirts of the city. Son of Maria, a seamstress who spent sleepless nights bent over her sewing machine to provide for the family, and Antonio, a construction worker whose calloused hands were like war medals from life itself, Gabriel grew up in the midst of hardships. The smell of cement and fabric was a constant in his childhood, mixed with the stories his mother told him before bed, not of princes or castles, but of ordinary people who, despite difficulties, always found the strength to carry on. From an early age, Gabriel showed an insatiable curiosity. While other children played in the dusty streets, he was enchanted by old books he borrowed from school or received as donations from neighbors. He read everything he could get his hands on: novels, newspapers, even mechanics' manuals. His mind worked like a silent engine, absorbing information and connecting ideas that few around him could understand. Yet life never handed him easy opportunities. At just 15, he lost his father in a work accident at a construction site. The weight of responsibility fell on his shoulders. He had to help his mother sustain the household and care for his younger sister, Clara, who was still a child. During that time, he began working as an assistant in a mechanics shop, where he learned about engines, gears, and the quiet logic of machines. His talent did not go unnoticed. The shop's owner, an elderly man named Mr. Afonso, saw a brilliant mind in the boy. One day, after Gabriel fixed an engine none of the experienced mechanics could figure out, Afonso remarked, "This boy has the mind of an engineer, but fate has thrown him into the life of a laborer." Those words stayed with Gabriel. He knew that in another reality, he could have been sitting in a university classroom competing in boardrooms. But life had placed a steering wheel in his hands instead of the pen of an executive. Still, within him, the same quiet flame of ambition kept burning. It was this path that eventually led him to become a chauffeur, first for wealthy families, then for executives, until he was finally hired by Santorini Bank. For many, driving a banker was the height of stability. For Gabriel, it was just another role where he had to swallow his pride, smile, and wait. While driving through the bustling streets of New York, transporting Ricardo Santorini to his appointments, Gabriel listened closely. His boss talked on the phone about million-dollar deals, negotiated complex agreements, discussed investments in international markets. And though he was treated as if invisible, Gabriel absorbed every word, as though those conversations were private lectures in economics and strategy. Clara, his younger sister, often teased him about it. "You should get a diploma just for listening to your boss's calls." Gabriel would laugh, but deep down she was right. Without realizing it, he had become a kind of self-taught student of finance and business, simply by paying attention. On the other side of the story was Ricardo Santorini. Heir to a banking dynasty, Ricardo had never known hardship. To him, money was not just power. It was his identity. Raised to conquer challenges effortlessly, he believed that anyone outside his social class was incapable of understanding the world he controlled. The contrast between the two men was like the clash of two universes. Ricardo, arrogant and wrapped in his bubble of luxury. Gabriel, humble but with a sharp and quiet mind, cultivated far from the spotlight. That night at the banquet, when the banker publicly ridiculed the chauffeur, few knew Gabriel's past. Few imagined that, behind the uniform and discreet posture, there was a man carrying not only the weight of survival, but also the burning desire to honor his father's memory and give his sister a better life. And at that very moment, while the guests waited to see whether he would accept the challenge or not, Gabriel knew he was not just defending himself. He was standing up for every time he had been called useless, for every night he had studied in secret, for every word of encouragement whispered by his mother, for every promise he had made to his father at his coffin. He could not back down. Not this time. The banker's grand dining hall remained lit by luxurious chandeliers, but the tension in the air was stronger than any golden glow. Riccardo Santorini's words echoed like a sentence. "I bet my fortune you can't do it." The laughter of the guests still reverberated against the walls, and everyone waited to see the chauffeur crushed under the weight of humiliation. Gabriel, standing before them all, did not allow shame to break him. His heart raced, but his gaze was steady. It wasn't the first time he had been treated as invisible, but it was the first time he would have the chance to prove that invisible did not mean incapable. "And what would the challenge be, sir?" he asked calmly, his voice unwavering. Riccardo raised his eyebrows, surprised at the chauffeur's audacity. The room fell silent. He hadn't expected Gabriel to respond with such composure. "A simple challenge," Riccardo replied, leaning back in his chair, savoring the moment. "I'll give you 1 week. 1 week to multiply this sum." He pulled out a check from his tailored jacket and scribbled a number, $10,000. "Bring me results in 7 days. If you succeed, I'll admit your victory right here. But if you fail, well, it will just prove that a driver will never be more than that." The guests laughed again, some shocked, others entertained. To them, it seemed impossible. How could a simple chauffeur with no connections or formal education possibly turn $10,000 into something meaningful in the eyes of a banker accustomed to dealing with millions? Gabriel took the check carefully. In his mind, he saw his mother's eyes, his sister waiting at home, and even his father, watching from somewhere far away. He knew this was not just about money, it was about dignity. That night, when he returned home, Clara was waiting with a simple dinner on the table. She noticed her brother's distant expression and asked, "What happened, Gabriel?" He told her everything, from the humiliation to the challenge. Clara's eyes widened. "They want to laugh at you. This banker doesn't expect you to succeed. He wants you to become the week's joke." Gabriel nodded. "I know, but I can't back down. I can't run from something that might change our lives." Clara held her brother's hand tightly. "Then you'll prove it. Not for them, but for us." And so the preparation began. Gabriel had no connections on Wall Street, no investors at his disposal. But he had something others didn't. Years of overhearing conversations in the car. He knew about risks, strategies, company names, emerging trends. His mind had absorbed it all, like an invisible recorder. The next day, while driving, he started planning. His first idea came from a memory. Riccardo once mentioned investing in small tech startups. Risky, yes, but startups had the potential for rapid growth. And with only $10,000, there was no room for conservative moves. At night, Gabriel spent hours in front of the old computer he kept in his room. He used the neighbor's Wi-Fi, paying a few dollars for access. He devoured reports, news articles, investor forums. His mind connected dots, filtered information, calculated risks, but he was not alone. His old mentor, Mr. Afonso, came to visit after hearing about the challenge. "You've always been smarter than you thought, Gabriel. What you need is not just money, it's vision. Use what you know. You've listened to the powerful for years. Now it's your turn to play the same game." Those words were fuel. Gabriel devised a bold plan. Invest part of the money in a promising renewable energy startup whose stock was about to rise after a government contract announcement. With the other part, he would make quick trades in the market, taking advantage of small variations that big investors ignored. Meanwhile, Riccardo's circle laughed at the situation. The banker bragged in clubs and dinners. "My chauffeur actually believes he can win in 7 days. Can you imagine?" And everyone toasted, certain of Gabriel's imminent defeat. But Riccardo didn't know that every time he sat in the back seat and spoke of his strategies, Gabriel had listened more than he ever should have. He had become the banker's silent student. Time raced on. Each day was a battle. Gabriel felt the weight of responsibility in every click, every decision. But with each step, his confidence grew. He began to realize that this was not just about the money. It was his chance to show the world and himself that he had always been capable. And in the midst of it, rumors began to spread among some of Ricardo's acquaintances. His driver is actually trying, and it looks like he knows what he's doing. The shadow of surprise was starting to take shape. The days that followed were a race against time. Gabriel knew he had only 7 days to turn $10,000 into something so impactful it could silence the banker and his entire mocking audience. Each sunrise brought new pressure, but also new determination. The small room he lived in, with peeling walls and an improvised desk, became his war room. The glow of his old computer lit up his eyes through sleepless nights filled with reading, calculations, and notes. Old notebooks, yellowed with time, filled with scribbles on market forecasts, investment possibilities, and risk strategies. Gabriel was no banker. He didn't have an army of analysts or million-dollar software, but he had something others didn't: years of silent listening. While driving Ricardo to meetings and luncheons, he had absorbed conversations about mergers, acquisitions, promising stocks, and looming bankruptcies. Now, each detail stored in his memory came alive, fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. "You need to be bold, but not reckless," warned Mr. Afonso, his mentor, during one of his late-night visits. "The banker wants you to throw everything into a suicidal gamble, but intelligence lies in dividing risk." Gabriel nodded, and so he began to shape his plan. The first move was to invest half the money in shares of a renewable energy startup, one he knew was about to announce a multi-million-dollar government contract. This information wasn't in the headlines yet, but Gabriel remembered clearly. Ricardo had once mentioned it to a partner, believing no one else was paying attention. With the other half, Gabriel engaged in smaller, faster, riskier trades, riding the daily waves of the market. He scoured independent investor forums, international news, even rumors circulating among small business owners. It was like walking a tightrope, but each step sharpened his balance. Clara, his sister, watched closely. She made coffee during the long nights when Gabriel never left the computer. "You're going to make it," she said, repeating it like a mantra. "They'll be shocked." But obstacles soon appeared. On the third day, the startup's stock suddenly dropped due to a rumor that the contract might be delayed. Gabriel felt his heart sink. The phone rang. It was Mr. Afonso. "Don't panic, boy. The market is like the sea, full of waves. If you drown in the first tide, you'll never reach the shore." Taking a deep breath, Gabriel decided to hold his position, trusting the information he had overheard years ago. At the same time, he doubled down on his quick trades to recover the lost value. He slept only 2 hours that night, his eyes bloodshot, his body exhausted, but his mind burning with calculations. Meanwhile, Ricardo amused himself in his social circles. He told the story as if it were a private joke. "Just imagine, gentlemen, my chauffeur thinks he can become a successful investor in a single week," he said, raising his wine glass, drawing laughter from his peers. The banker had no idea Gabriel was already paving a solid path. On the 5th day, everything changed. The startup officially announced the government contract. Within hours, the stock price skyrocketed. The value of Gabriel's investment nearly doubled, and his risky strategy began to bear fruit. The crushing weight on his shoulders turned into a burning flame of hope. But it wasn't just profit that drove him now. It was the feeling that, for the first time, he was writing his own story, not just playing a background role in someone else's play. That night, Clara walked into the room and found her brother with tears in his eyes in front of the screen. "What is it, Gabriel?" she asked, worried. He smiled, exhausted, but with a new fire in his gaze. "I think I'm doing it, Clara. I think I'll finally prove I was never just a driver." The 6th day was even more intense. Gabriel prepared not only financially, but also emotionally, for the final confrontation. He knew Ricardo would not admit defeat easily. He needed irrefutable numbers, undeniable proof. So he organized reports, statements, charts. He prepared like a warrior before the decisive battle. Every detail mattered. He reviewed the calculations until dawn, writing everything into a simple yet sturdy folder. That folder was his sword, his defense against years of humiliation. When the seventh day broke, Gabriel looked at the original check still tucked away in his drawer and smiled. He had multiplied that money in a way no one expected. He was ready to face Riccardo Santorini and all his arrogance. The game had turned. The night of the seventh day arrived wrapped in a tension so heavy it was almost tangible. The grand hall of the private club where Ricardo often gathered his friends and partners was packed. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the champagne flutes, and laughter echoed off walls lined with million-dollar paintings. Everyone was there, eager to witness the spectacle the banker had promised, the public downfall of a mere chauffeur. Ricardo entered the hall with his usual arrogance, the smug smile of someone who already considered himself victorious stamped on his face. He wore a tailored suit, a flawless red tie, and in his hands carried an expensive bottle of wine he intended to open to celebrate the lesson he was about to teach Gabriel. "Gentlemen, prepare yourselves for a night to remember," he announced, his booming voice dominating the room. "Tonight, we will witness the end of an illusion." When Gabriel walked into the hall, the contrast was striking. He wore a simple suit, neatly pressed but modest, and carried nothing more than a black folder in his hands. No bodyguards, no grandeur, just an ordinary man determined to prove his worth. Clara, by his side, squeezed his hand discreetly, lending him silent strength. The guests turned their eyes on him with disdain, as though he were an intruder. Some chuckled under their breath, others whispered, "Seriously? The chauffeur thinks he can beat Ricardo? This is going to be fun." Ricardo raised his glass, laughing loudly. "So, Gabriel, are you ready to hand me back the check? I imagine you lost every last penny on foolish bets." But Gabriel did not respond with anger. He simply opened the folder calmly and laid out reports, statements, and receipts on the table. "Mr. Ricardo, here are the results of the week. I used the $10,000 just as you instructed, and with them, I achieved something you probably never expected." An uneasy silence fell. The guests leaned closer, curious. Gabriel slid forward the first document. It was a statement showing the rise in value of the renewable energy startup's shares. "I invested half of the money here. This company has just announced a government contract. The stock price skyrocketed, and what I invested nearly doubled." Eyebrows rose, murmurs rippled across the hall. Ricardo forced a laugh. "A stroke of luck," he said, trying to mask his surprise. "Nothing more than that." Gabriel remained calm and revealed the rest of the papers. The other half went into quick trades, taking advantage of daily market movements. Here are the receipts, charts, and reports. Altogether, the initial $10,000 turned into $135,000 in just 7 days. This time, the reaction was explosive. The hall filled with gasps, disbelieving voices, and exclamations of shock. Some stood up to see the documents closer, others exchanged wide-eyed looks. For the first time in a long while, Ricardo was speechless. His face drained of color, the smile gone. This is impossible," he stammered. "You must have cheated." Gabriel met his gaze steadily, his eyes filled with a courage he had never before shown in front of him. "You've always believed knowledge belonged only to the powerful. But I learned by listening to your conversations, observing your deals. I didn't need millions or connections. I only used what you always ignored: discipline, attention, and faith in myself." A heavy silence fell over the room. Ricardo tried to compose himself, but it was clear he had lost control of the situation. His friends, once ready to laugh, now looked at him with disapproval, some even with scorn. Clara, moved to tears, squeezed her brother's hand with pride. The banker, who had wagered his fortune on Gabriel's failure, now stood before an audience that had witnessed his moral defeat. And for the first time, the chauffeur no longer looked small beside his employer. On the contrary, it was Ricardo who now seemed diminished under the weight of every watching eye. The hall was still buzzing with murmurs when Ricardo tried to recover his composure. He ran a hand through his hair, straightened his tie, and with a forced laugh said, "Bravo, Gabriel. You made a few good moves, but turning 10,000 into 135,000 is nothing compared to my fortune. A drop in the ocean." Gabriel calmly closed the folder and met his eyes. His voice rang firm, different from the humble tone he usually used. "You're right, Ricardo. Compared to your fortune, what I achieved is still small. But the truth is, this was never about money. It was about proving I am not the man you always said I was." A sharp silence cut through the room. Every eye was on them. And then Clara, who had remained silent until that moment, stepped forward. "He's right, Gabriel," she said, her voice trembling but filled with conviction. "This isn't just about money. It's about justice." She opened her bag and pulled out a yellowed envelope, old, with the seal still intact. Gabriel looked at her, confused. "What is that?" he asked. Clara took a deep breath. Her eyes turned to Ricardo, who now seemed uneasy. "It's your mother's will, Gabriel. I found it hidden among old papers in the office." A wave of shock rippled through the hall. Ricardo turned pale, swallowing hard. "This is absurd," he shouted, trying to sound confident. "A chauffeur has nothing to do with my past." But Clara opened the envelope and revealed the document before everyone. The words were clear. Gabriel's mother had once worked for Ricardo's family, and in her last will, she had left a significant part of her inheritance to her own son, Gabriel. Ricardo's hands trembled. The guests began to stir, whispering, "Is he the rightful heir? Did the banker hide this all along?" Gabriel was in shock. He had never imagined his mother had direct ties to Ricardo, much less that she had left something for him. This can't be true," he murmured, his voice breaking. Clara held his hand firmly. "It's true, Gabriel. The man who humiliated you, who bet against you, always knew. He hid it because he didn't want to share anything, because he always believed you weren't capable." The hall erupted in outrage, whispers, and accusatory glares directed at Ricardo. The once all-powerful banker was now nothing more than a cornered man, unmasked before his own elite. "You don't understand," he cried desperately. "He would never have achieved anything without me. He's just a chauffeur." But his words echoed hollow, stripped of weight, stripped of authority. Gabriel, though shaken, straightened himself and lifted his head. "Maybe I am just a chauffeur, Ricardo, but tonight I proved I don't need your money or your approval. All I ever needed was to believe in myself." The applause began timidly, but soon grew until it filled the hall. People who once looked down on him now clapped for him, not only for the financial victory, but for defeating, with dignity, the arrogance of a man who thought himself untouchable. Ricardo staggered out of the hall, defeated, while Gabriel remained standing tall, finally recognized not as a mere chauffeur, but as a man capable of rewriting his own story. After that night, nothing was ever the same again. The hall that had once been the stage for Ricardo's pride and arrogance was now remembered as the place where his mask fell before everyone's eyes. The banker, once seen as a symbol of power and untouchability, became an example of arrogance and downfall. His reputation collapsed within days. Clients and partners distanced themselves, investors withdrew their support, and his fortune quickly began to shrink, corroded by the lack of trust. Gabriel, on the other hand, never sought revenge. He continued living simply, keeping the same calm and discreet demeanor he had always carried. But now, he had something no one could ever take from him: dignity, recognition, and the certainty that his mother had left behind a legacy he never even imagined. The will was not just about material possessions. It was proof that he had always had value, even when others tried to convince him otherwise. Clara remained by his side, not as a savior, but as someone who had believed in his strength when no one else did. Together, they decided to use part of the inheritance to create a foundation to help young people from humble families study and pursue their dreams, so that no one would ever again be treated as incapable just because of their background or profession. His former fellow drivers, who had so often shared the same pain of social invisibility, now saw him as an inspiration. Gabriel did not become a millionaire overnight, but he became something far greater, a symbol of resilience, courage, and perseverance. Years later, when someone asked him about that night, Gabriel would smile calmly and reply, "It was never about money, nor about proving anything to him. It was about showing myself that I could." And so, his story spread as a timeless lesson. Never underestimate someone because of their profession, their origins, or their appearance. Life always finds a way to put everyone in their rightful place. In the end, the banker's arrogant phrase became nothing more than an empty echo of the past. "I bet my fortune you can't do it." For in that moment, the chauffeur not only did it, he showed the entire world that a person's true worth is not in their bank account, but in their courage to believe in themselves.